Welcome to part 7 of Bitovi Academy's Learn Docker training. If we take a look at our image size, you'll see my Node app is a staggering 944 megabytes. It's huge. Reducing its total size is going to make it faster to pull and start up in production. Also, always running our Node app with NodeMon is wasteful from both a CPU and memory consumption perspective. We are going to look at two strategies to address these issues. First, we're going to be changing the from instruction of our Docker file. We are currently using Node 15 as our base image. Node, along with many other official Docker images, provide variants that can allow us to customize what we need. This is Docker Hub. If we search for Node, we'll find the base image that we're using for our application. Scrolling down, we'll find a section on image variants. There are 3 different variants of the Node image. The first is what we're using right now, Node 15. This image contains Node, NPM, and various other libraries required to run applications. This is the default choice if you don't know what you need. Because of this, it's actually the largest of the 3 variants. The second variant is Node Alpine. The Alpine image is actually based off of the Alpine Linux project instead of Debian based. Alpine is a distribution that prides itself on being as small as possible. This is the smallest of the 3 variants, so it's the one that I like to use most often. If I start running into compatibility issues or my application has more complex requirements, then I'll always just bump up to the next image variant. The last variant is the Slim variant. This variant is also based off of Debian like the standard Node image, but only actually contains Node and NPM. We can run docker pull to pull the 3 variants and compare their size. We already have the standard Node 15 image, but we'll pull Node 15 Alpine, and Node 15 Slim. Now that we've pulled our images, we can compare the 3 variants with Docker image ls node. We'll see that the standard Node 15 image is 935 megabytes, the Slim variant is 160 megabytes, and the Alpine variant is 109 megabytes. That means we can drastically reduce the size of our image by changing our from statement to Node 15-Alpine. Now if we build our image again with docker build-t my Node app, and for comparison we're just going to take it as Alpine. And now that our image is built, if we compare the size with docker image ls my Node app, we can see we've gone down from 944 megabytes to 118 megabytes. That's a significant benefit for such a small change. This next change is a little bit more complicated. Instead of running npm start every time, which is associated with the NodeMon process, ideally we'd be able to conditionally decide whether this is a development image or a production image, and then conditionally run npm start or npm start prod. Unfortunately, Docker files don't support easy conditionals with if statements. Instead, we're going to use multi-stage builds in order to accomplish this. Multi-stage builds involve putting multiple from statements in your Docker file. In the same way that our Docker file uses Node 15 as its base image, and then that layers all the way down to Scratch, we can define multiple layers in a single Docker file and then tell Docker when we're building the image which layers or stages to run. This is especially powerful in compiled languages like Java or Go, where you can have a base layer that does all the compilation of your application, and then you have a super lightweight runtime layer that only contains the application artifact from that build layer, and then the binaries for the application to actually run. In our case, we're going to define our first layer with the same from statement, and we're going to name our first layer prod with an as statement. Then we're going to go down to our npm install statement, and we're going to tell it to only install our prod dependencies. This will keep our node modules light because it won't be installing any dev dependencies like nodemon. Lastly, we're going to change our CMD from npm start to npm run start prod to run our application with the node executable instead of nodemon. Now we're going to introduce multi-stage builds by using our prod image that we've just defined here as the base for a new image we're going to call dev. So we're going to say from prod as dev. So this prod comes from this name up here, and then we're just going to call our second stage here dev. Our dev stage is only going to contain 2 instructions. It's going to run npm install, this time passing in only dev, so it'll install the nodemon or any other dev dependencies we have. And then we're going to change our CMD to npm start. And that's it. I'm just going to condense all this to make it a little bit more readable. Now when we want to build our image, we're going to run docker build, same as before. We're going to call it my node app. And we're going to take it as production because we want to run a prod build. And we're going to add the -- target equals prod command. And that's going to tell docker build to only run the prod stage we have defined up here. Now if we want to run a dev build, we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to tag our image as dev, and we're going to run target dev. Now if we run docker image ls my node app, we can see we have our prod image and our dev image. Now if we want to test our images, we can run docker run in the same way as before. If we want to run our dev container, we'll call it my dev container. We'll map 8000 to 8000 -d. We'll add our volume mapping. And then we'll tell it to run my node app dev. And then if we want to run our production image, we'll just rename the container to prod. We need to run on a different local host port. And we don't need the volume mapping because we aren't running it with nodemon anymore. And then we'll just tell it to run my node app prod. Okay, so now if we look at the logs for my dev container, we can see it's running the application with nodemon, which means it's watching for any code changes. But if we look at the logs for the prod container, we'll see it's just running with standard node executable. We can of course test this by opening up our browser to localhost port 8000, which is our dev container, and opening up another tab to localhost port 9000, which is our production container. And then we can test the hot code reloading of our dev container by changing hello Bitovi back to hello world. And if we go back to our browser, our production container should stay the same because it's not running with nodemon and we don't have our volumes mounted. And then our dev container, if we refresh, we're still getting that hot code reloading. And that's it. By introducing multi-stage builds, we've created a production image that only contains the node modules it needs to run and is running with node instead of nodemon, making it far more lightweight, without sacrificing the functionality we need for local development with nodemon and volume mounting. With everything we've covered so far, there's a lot of complexity around remembering the right flags to pass in for both docker build and docker run commands. In the next section, we're going to look at using Docker Compose to store all these flags in a Docker Compose file.